All right, we are live. Welcome everybody to the last From the Swamp to the States episode before Election Day. This is the podcast from Americans for Tax Reform, where we go across the 50 states to talk about the policies and politics that impact your wallet. We have two great guests with us today from South Carolina, Dallas Woodhouse and Bryce Fiedler. Welcome to the program, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Great to have you on. And South Carolina has a couple interesting measures we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about the context behind them and how taxpayers can save some money in South Carolina on Election Day. First, I want to ask you guys to give us a little background on South Carolina Policy Council, which you all are with.
Yes, thank you. So the South Carolina Policy Council is actually one of the original state-based think tanks founded by Mr. Thomas Rowe in 1986. And President Reagan and Thomas Rowe set on a mission to create state-based think tanks across the land, focusing on economic and spending issues. We also deal with education, some voting security, a lot of school choice, and we've also been working on these amendments here in South Carolina. And we've got an election coming up, but on Tuesday, like everybody else. And after that, we'll be headed into a important legislative session where we think there's a great opportunity for to further cut taxes, which South Carolina needs to do to remain competitive, to expand school choice, and to expand individual freedom.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because the amendments we're talking about are going to add reserves to the rainy day fund in the state, and we'll talk about the specifics there. But for South Carolina, how competitive is South Carolina tax-wise? Why have there been struggles to make the state more competitive?
So, there's good news and bad news to this story. We have a website we built called Back in the Game SC that shows that South Carolina did cut some income taxes and has set the stage to lower them further in the future. And that's been a good start this year. But South Carolina has got to build on that some more. North Carolina has a significantly lower marginal tax rates, as do Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida, which are our other neighbors, or close by, are states with no income taxes. So South Carolina, unfortunately, continues to be a higher tax state in the Southeast when it comes to income taxes. So we've got some work there to do. We have made some progress, and we're happy to report that. But there's much more to be done. Fortunately, South Carolina, like a lot of states right now, post-COVID, is in a pretty strong fiscal situation. They have a budget surplus, so there is certainly the ability in the future to provide all of the essential services that the citizens of the Palmetto State need, as well as look at significant tax relief and reform.
Bryce, anything you'd like to add, Bryce, on the tax climate there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as Dallas mentioned, we're getting back on the right path. That's why our website kind of aptly named it's inthegamesc.com for those that would go like to go and take a look and to see that the progress we've made. And also that site features generally kind of based on your income and whether you have children or you're single or you're married, kind of what you can expect in tax relief based on these income tax cuts. So we've talked a little bit about how South Carolina is known to have the highest top personal income tax rate in the Southeast at 7%. That was lowered this year to 6.5%, and that will continue to lower to 6% in the coming years. But another element of that people haven't talked about as much as we also consolidated our lower tax bracket as well, simplified that a lot. So people are saving money on both ends of that. And that is a change that I think will help us get closer to possibly the eventual goal of just having a flat income tax at some point. We've done good work on simplifying things quite a bit.
Yep. And if you're not cutting tax rates, as we've seen, we've talked a lot about it, Americans for Tax Reform, as a state, you're falling behind, because we've had around 20 states in the past 2 years reduce their state income tax rates, formally become no income tax states, like New Hampshire set a path to that. Kentucky has a path to eliminate their income tax, Louisiana. So we're seeing a lot of progress get made. States like Idaho, 2 tax cuts 2 years in a row. So you got to keep competing, and you guys are down there with North Carolina, which has been leading the way on using revenue triggers to eliminate their income tax and reduce it, and Florida, no income tax. Tennessee, like you guys said. So it's a competitive pool.
I think we continue to be worried, like a lot of states that have higher than average state income taxes, that states continue to put out these large incentive packages for new or large businesses, but don't necessarily treat fairly small homegrown businesses, small mom and pop stores that are the backbone of the South Carolina economy. So when we reduce the tax burden overall, we lessen the need for some of the corporate welfare that we see. I know all of us would like to see that kind of stuff go away. I don't see, a path to that right away. But I think when you make it just broadly cheaper to do business, you are enhancing the opportunity for job growth and creation in the broadest fashion, and not picking and choosing winners and losers. And so that's something we definitely want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it may reduce ribbon cutting opportunities for politicians, but it makes it easier to actually have the economy succeed. The government doesn't have to pick which business is going to be the next big success. They can let the brilliant, hardworking people of South Carolina get to work, and they'll figure it out for them. So it makes it easy mode, but you might miss out on a ribbon cutting opportunity. That could be a negative sometimes for politicians. And just a reminder to everybody who's watching, if you have questions, please just shoot them to us on social media, wherever you're watching, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. Just tag us there and let us know what question you'd like to ask, and we'll get them to Bryce and Dallas here. All right, so let's get into the amendments, and this will make it easier for South Carolina to pursue some significant tax reform if there's a little more flexibility, and rainy day funds are stashed away. Interesting stat here from Pew, which puts out some good research on this, that the average state, or median state can operate for 42 and a half days on the median rainy day funds. It's about 11.6% of spending. South Carolina in relatively decent shape compared to other states. Why do you all think these amendments, we're talking about Amendment 1 and 2, are necessary to provide some extra rainy day funding?
I'll start with sort of the broad picture and then turn it over to Bryce. States with healthy reserve funds are able to do two things. As we know, the federal government has a bad habit of printing money it doesn't have, but the states can't do that. And so when economic times get bad, and we look like we're headed there, hopefully it won't be like 2008 or something like that, state governments end up running deficits. People get out of work, they don't pay as much taxes, and state government doesn't have as much money as it needs, or it thinks it needs, to pay teachers and pay police officers and provide other critical government services. So they then have two choices. They can pick one, the other, or both. And that is, large drops in government services, which can be unpleasant, and of course tax increases. And we want to see both those things avoided. So really, the two big points about these amendments is, you can get into the wordiness and exactly what they do, but at the end of the day, they require the state to spend a little less and save a little more for a rainy day, so we can avoid tax increases and sharp drops in government services in the time of economic disaster, which can be in South Carolina. We have a propensity for hurricanes. It can come from a natural disaster, or it can come from an economic disaster, which right now the Biden administration is heading us towards. So that's what we're guarding against. We want, this allows the voters of South Carolina to tell their government to spend a little less now, save more, prepare for a rainy day. And the second point I'll bring up is there is something, these amendments are very bipartisan. They passed, and that's a great sign. They passed overwhelmingly in the legislature to go on the ballot by Republicans and Democrats. It was just one dissenting vote in both chambers. So both sides of the political aisle recognize the wisdom of doing this. I think on the left, they may be a little more concerned about cuts to government programs. On the right, we might be a little more concerned about tax increases. But this provides something for both sides to like, and both sides to get, behind something that is good government for the state of South Carolina in a broad bipartisan way.
Absolutely. And I'll just jump in a little bit, just so the audience kind of knows what these amendments generally deal with. So we have two reserve funds here in South Carolina. We've got a general reserve fund and a capital reserve fund. Together, they make up a 7% kind of reserve account ratio for our rainy day savings funds if we need them. And so the basic idea, and they can serve a couple of different purposes, but the basic idea is that they serve as a shield against year-end budget deficits, right? So if one were to occur, basically first funds are tapped from the capital reserve fund. And if we need more money to cover the deficit, then we tap into the general reserve fund there as well. And so the amendments would just simply increase how much we have to constitutionally set aside each year into these funds. And that amount is kind of based on what our budget looked like in the previous year. So you're not going to see massive jumps or reductions unless we have massive jumps or reductions in the budget. So things should be pretty consistent and in those terms, at least. But an element of these amendments, which I think has kind of gone under discussed, is the fact that, yes, they do increase how much we have to set aside of these funds, but also it would kind of restore the original purpose of one of these funds to say that in the event of a mid-year budget reduction, we can use the capital reserve fund to try to maintain funding levels as they were established in the budget. And so that used to be the case with the capital reserve fund. We changed that about a decade ago. So like currently, if the state economists see that we need to make budget cuts, they're basically done across the board to all state agencies up to 3%. And if things are really bad, the legislature comes back and then decides where they need to cut funding a little bit more. So not only are we saving for year-end budget deficits, but we're also kind of setting up a little buffer for the mid-year economy as well.
And so you said if there's a downturn, there's across the board 3% cuts. And is that a provision that you all have in law?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It is. And so if Amendment 2 passes, Amendment 2 is dealing with the Capital Reserve Fund. Basically, it would say that if the state economists see that we need to make mid-year budget cuts, that first we use the funding in the Capital Reserve Fund before we do those across-the-board budget cuts for state agencies. So it brings a little bit of stability and predictability to government as well.
Okay. Very interesting. And then and it also, like you said, the capital funds currently could not be used in that manner. So
right.
It also allows that option.
Right. And as that was its original purpose to do that. We've made some changes to the funds kind of throughout their 3-decade history. And so passing Amendment 2 would also restore that purpose of creating kind of that mid-year budget buffer reduction.
Okay. That's very interesting. And you said that the history of how long have these funds in this form been around, and have there been instances in the past where there's been a problem there that there either wasn't enough funds or there's fighting over where the funds are going, what gap needs to be closed, and that type of thing? Is there any history there that you all are now fixing with these amendments?
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, the history shows that we're glad that we have them, right? So the funds were established in 1987. And between then and 2011, so the General Reserve Fund, which is kind of the last line of defense, that was depleted 4 times, and the Capital Reserve Fund was depleted 9 times. And even still with those funds in place, state agencies in 6 different years still saw reductions. So, the idea here is that saving for a rainy day isn't just a hypothetical situation, right? The financial history of our state shows that these are essential, and perhaps that they aren't sufficient enough if we're depleting them so frequently over the years. And so most recently, obviously, everyone remembers the Great Recession of 2008, which hit the entire country very hard, including state budgets. And that was the last time that we saw those funds depleted. And then shortly thereafter, voters or people voted to increase the General Reserve Fund to the 5% level that it's at now. So I think that the legislature kind of wisely realized that we needed a little bit more of a buffer and acted.
Okay. Well, very good. Yeah, great explanation. And Dallas, you had mentioned there's a bipartisan support, there's broad support. Is there opposition? What's the opposition to?
We really haven't found opposition, but I think this is the kind of important part is the amendments are wordy and kind of clunky on the ballot. The South Carolina Policy Council has expanded its polling operation and its public opinion survey work. And when we did some work on this earlier in the year, we found, marginal support for the amendments when we read the text of the amendments on the ballot. When we explained them in plain language, they did far better. So I think the vulnerability of the amendments is voter confusion, not lack of voter support, if they understand them. So that's why we're glad to be on your program today to continue our efforts. We've traveled around the state with Americans for Tax Reform, did a statewide media tour, have engaged a lot of voters, and we've provided message points and things to tweet out for lawmakers. And we've sort of been the lead dog in this hunt to just make sure voters understand these amendments. And we think we've made some progress, and we feel pretty good about Tuesday. The fact is South Carolina needs to save more and spend less compared to other states. Our reserve funds are not adequate. And we think we've made progress, and we just got to keep working on it all the way up until the final votes are cast on Tuesday. And it's also at the end of the ballot, so you want to make sure people stick around and actually mark their ballots for them, and just don't have some ballot fatigue.
Absolutely right. And just to add on to what Dallas said, when we did our poll, we kind of did A/B tested, right? So we tested with just the plain ballot, the plain amendment language, and then we also followed up with an explanation. And basically the takeaway was if people understand what these amendments do in kind of plain English, they tend to be much more favorable towards them. And so we found success with the poll. As Dallas mentioned, we went and talked to voters and the media across the state to kind of get the message out and to really break it down into simple terms, because one of the potential downsides when you're talking about kind of budget-related amendments is you don't want to get too much into the weeds and lose people into the details so that they don't really fully understand what's going on, and just kind of bring it back to the basics. So as Dallas said, the idea is to save more, spend less, and just to reiterate, these amendments do not raise taxes. So.
Absolutely. Well, it certainly can be a challenge. We're happy to help on the education side of things. You get wonky, arcane language amendments on the end of a ballot. People are ready to go get lunch, and sometimes they just turn it in. So important to just flag that these are on there so people know what the opportunity is, why it's important, and what's going on there. So we're happy to lend our help there. And again, if anybody has questions, feel free to shoot them into the chat, and we'll get to those. Starting to get close to the end of our time together, but you mentioned the polling in your work in the state. It sounds like there's a decent opportunity here. The primary thing is voter awareness and making sure that people turn in enough votes to actually approve these if they want to do that. So if they go through, what's the next step? So we get them through, we go into next session. what can taxpayers be excited about now that these are approved?
Well, I mean, I'd be lying to say these are the most exciting things in the world. It's just a matter of good governance, and the good news
Good
is not
governance is
everything.
exciting.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing is not everything is overly partisan. Yeah, there are good stewards of South Carolina's economy on both sides of the aisle. And the legislature wisely in the past session has already funded putting this money aside pending the passage of the amendments. So the South Carolina taxpayer is not going to see any negative consequences or any effects. As we know, state governments have a lot of difficulties to deal with, and they're often reactive. They have to react to bad situations. They have to react to a hurricane when it comes through and it's very expensive. They have to react to downturns in the economy. They have to react to COVID. This is one of the unique opportunities that government has to get ahead of the game and prepare for a rainy day before it is forced upon us. And of course, we think there's also the ancillary benefit that we are encouraging South Carolina lawmakers to go further and do much more with tax cuts, and knowing that there is sufficient revenue in the case of a downturn is one path to do that. So that's one of the important things for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate, like we cut our taxes earlier this year, and the last thing we would want is to run into a situation where now there's calls to raise taxes because we just got ourselves into a recession and we're kind of backtracking on progress we immediately made. And so I think one way to look at this is we're kind of making the best out of a potentially bad situation that we may be walking into here, right? You basically have all of your major economists at this point saying a recession is not, if not inevitable, extremely likely at this point. You even have people, saying that the Fed themselves should be willing to increase interest rates so much that they cause a recession just to get inflation under control. So we're walking into some unknown territory here in terms of the economy, and I just think that the best thing states can do is to be prepared with a sufficient rainy day fund, and that certainly applies to South Carolina.
Well, what's the saying? There's that joke, the recession, technically correct is the best type of correct. So technically we're already in a recession. I think it's fair to make that a live concern. Certainly when we go around the country talking to state legislators, some of them, and I would say that, relatively frequent, that there's at least a few legislators in each state who, we're talking about tax reform, looking to reduce the tax burden. There's definitely a concern about what happens with the next downturn, what happens when we get, people complaining at us and fighting over scraps because revenues start to go down. If you can answer that question with measures like this preemptively, it certainly helps when it comes to reducing the tax burden.
Of course, let's not forget that our broader belief is if we cut some taxes and make the economic situation better for South Carolina, we're less likely to go into those those down cycles anyway. I mean, of course, we will still have downturns in the economy, but if you have a broadly based, more healthy economic set of conditions in your state where you have a healthy reserve fund, you have healthy small business, you have healthy large business, you have healthy economic opportunity, then the downtimes aren't near as down anyway.
Yeah, and we've seen states in great fiscal health. They've had a lot of money, and of course, we've had federal bailouts late last year. So there's been the cash around to cut taxes, and those questions may become slightly more difficult if we do start to see revenues come down. But certainly, I mean, the revenues have been there. States have been swimming in money, and we want to see those the tax rates come down in each state, and that competition is continuing to heat up.
You also are concerned that, and I think we're fortunate that we haven't seen a lot of this in South Carolina. We've had wise leadership, but I mean, the danger is when the states are all on a sugar high, is to create a new bunch of government programs that I mean, the COVID money at the end of the day is one-time money and create a lot of ongoing obligations. So setting one-time money into reserve for one-time shortfalls in budgets due to a downturn in the economy is an extraordinarily wise way to use some of these funds, as opposed to creating long-term government obligations that may not be sustainable.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely a mistake we don't like to see is using one-time money to create continuing costs. And that's a mistake that some states have made. And so this is a good way to plug any of those holes that pop up, like you said, Dallas, and make sure that the ride remains smooth and that tax reform can remain on track. Is there any specific tax reform package at this point that you all are looking at next session, or is this more step one to working on that?
I'll let Bryce jump in. So to not be real technical here, but we have some triggers and acceleration that will cut the taxes a little more over time. For our taste, that A, it's not quite enough, and B, it extends over too long of a period. So I think if the revenues are healthy, I think there is an easy argument to say let's speed this up a little bit, and let's go ahead and take it down another point or two, and let's do it a little faster. I don't think we're looking at reinventing the wheel. I think one of the things South Carolina might look to do is further consolidate its brackets. They did good work there. Other states have, basically adopted one bracket, two brackets, a zero bracket, and then one bracket. So, A, you address some of the regressivity, but B, you treat all taxpayers the same. So those are a couple of things we'd at least like to see explored.
Yeah, no, I think Dallas kind of nailed it on the head, and that's what I was going to say as well. Just speed up how fast we're getting to the goal of lowering that top rate. But eventually the long-term goal should certainly be to just simplify the tax code, that you just have one rate. So you're not getting, once you get above a certain income level, you're not getting taxed at an exponential level. It's just kind of smooth sailing even the whole way through.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to be talking a little bit about that in just a few minutes with our next group of guests on the live stream. And Massachusetts, as a measure to implement a so-called millionaire's tax, always comes with unintended downsides, or at least not advertised downsides. So we'll shift over to that discussion in just a couple minutes. If you have any questions, last chance for Bryce and Dallas, and really appreciate you guys joining us. And again, it's South Carolina Amendment 1, Amendment 2, and they both are increasing reserves in South Carolina's two reserve funds. 7% up to 10%?
That would be, if both amendments pass, we'll get to a combined 10%.
Very good. So, and where can folks find the good work you guys are doing at South Carolina Policy Council?
Yeah, you can just find us online at scpolicycouncil.org. You can find us on Twitter at SC Policy Council, and you can also find us on Facebook at SC Policy Council. We also have a YouTube channel. If you'd like to watch some of us discuss some of our research, just look up SC Policy Council on YouTube.
And I just would mention, too, that we have a great partnership with Americans for Tax Reform. We work a lot with a great fellow that lives just north of us up in North Carolina, Patrick Gleason, who works for ATR. And we're already looking at doing some things in South Carolina to fight this horrific ESG movement, and looking at some judicial reform efforts. And it's just a great partnership we have with Americans for Tax Reform, and we're very lucky to have that.
Well, we appreciate that. We'll have to drag Patrick on the podcast at some point, get him on here, maybe to talk about a Forbes column at some point soon. So really appreciate that, and glad we could have you both on. And we'll see how this wraps up very soon. Just a few more days, and we'll do a podcast sort of summarizing all of the measures we've talked about, and that are in ATR's ballot measure guide at atr.org. So thank you all. And we'll switch over. We have a couple other folks coming on to talk about state tax measures. I mentioned Massachusetts, and we'll also be talking about Colorado. Colorado is a state that has a yin and a yang. We got a tax hike, or what I would say is an effective tax increase, limiting income eligible for tax deductions, and a tax cut on the ballot in Colorado. And we got the tax increase in Massachusetts as the left continues to try to get around the flat tax in the blue states that still have them. It was Illinois they targeted last year or last cycle, and now Massachusetts. So we'll get those guests on shortly. Again, thanks Bryce and Dallas. We'll let you get moving on here, and appreciate you all joining again.
Thank you so much for having us.
We'll see. We're going to swap out here so people see the screens moving. First time we're bringing people on live while other folks are on live. So hopefully we'll get a smooth transition here. So it looks like we have Ben in here. All right, very good. So again, I'll just remind folks who are watching the live stream, talking about tax ballot measures that are on the ballot Tuesday that we cover in ATR's 2022 state ballot measure guide. It's atr.org/ballot guide. And we have 7 total measures that are specific to tax that are in there: California, Arizona, Massachusetts, South Carolina, Colorado, and maybe we have an honorable mention for some of the pure bonding spending measures in New Mexico and New York. Some significant spending there that folks should learn more about as well. So that's the topic today. Want to make sure we cover as much as we can before we hit election day and people have to go into the ballot measure or ballot booth and figure out what the heck they're voting on. There's a lot on some of these state ballots. So happy to do what we can to help there. And we'll welcome in our next couple guests. We have Ben Murray from Colorado. So it looks like we have Ben live here. So briefly mention what Colorado has on the ballot. So some significant tax questions there. So Ben is with Independent Institute in Colorado. Welcome to the live stream, Ben. Hopefully you can hear me and we can hear you clearly.
Yep, I can hear you well. Do you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Is my camera really as dim as it looks to me? I don't know how to fix that.
It looks slightly in the dark, but it's air of mystery.
Yeah, you
have a desk lamp, you can throw it on.
Yeah, no, I have one on. I'm using a new camera, and I think what's happening is the camera is automatically adjusting and thinking that it's brighter in the room than it really is. Doesn't make sense. And I don't know how to go to the manual settings on the camera.
Well, we have to run with it. I wish this was the first time something like that had happened, because the motion sensor lights in our office go out. So if anybody's watched more than one of these, they've probably seen that happen on my end. So I'm not able to judge. But let's start talking about the Colorado situation. I think, like South Carolina, we were just talking about the background as to what's going on. So we can get into sort of the specifics of the measures. But Ben, how has Colorado ended up in a spot where we have, sort of an effective tax hike and a tax cut on the ballot at the same time? What's going on there?
Yeah, so a lot of that has to do with, well, at least with the tax hike, it requires understanding a special provision in our Constitution called TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights.
Right.
And, the proponents of this measure, it's Proposition 123, I think is what you're talking about. This is a measure that would designate a certain amount of income tax revenue, which would generally go into the general fund for the legislature to spend. It would designate a certain amount of that revenue to housing programs in the state. And the proponents of the measure will tell you, well, it doesn't raise taxes, which it's true that it doesn't increase tax rates. But what it does is it has an interesting interplay with our Taxpayer Bill of Rights, where in the present year, last year, for the next 3 years at least, that's as far out as our state forecasters go, we are expected to get refunds, taxpayer refunds. Now, this isn't your refund when you file your taxes. This is a TABOR refund. And what it is TABOR caps the amount of revenue the state can keep. and we're exceeding those refunds. We're getting these Tabor surpluses for at least 5 consecutive years, according to current forecasts. And what this measure does is it takes a certain amount of revenue and it earmarks it for affordable housing spending. The thing is that revenue was not revenue that was going to go to the state. It's revenue that was going to be refunded to voters because it's revenue above what the state's allowed to keep, right? So effectively, this is a tax hike for Coloradans because they'll get to keep less of their own money. Less of that money will be refunded to them above the surplus. Mm-hmm. Did I explain that well? Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, I think largely that makes sense.
And so the proponents of this measure, of this housing measure, going around telling voters, "Oh, this isn't a tax hike. This isn't a tax hike." Well, it is. I mean, more of your money, if you're a Coloradan, more of your money will be going to government instead of staying in your pocket if this measure passes.
And so I think we uncovered a couple of things here. So you have Prop 123, catchy, and that's what you're talking about now, which is shifting that tax revenue, forcing it to go to housing projects. And there's a number of ways that is spent. I mean, it's really not that simple. That's just sort of the headline claim. And then there's Proposition FF, which limits the eligibility, the amount of income eligible for income tax deduction. So explain that to us.
FF is what I'm calling the free food measure. That's how I remember it. Free food. This
no
is
such thing as a free lunch. So this will be a first.
This one, honestly, it's not one that we're involving ourselves with a whole lot. It provides free lunch to all public school students in the state, not just those who qualify for the federal free lunch program. I don't know if that's going to pass or not, but frankly, it's not one that I'm paying a whole lot of attention to. The ones I care about more, because in Independence Institute, we have a much broader goal of taking Colorado to zero income tax, and so what we're interested in is measures that might stand in the way of doing that. So I don't like Proposition 123 because that's effectively a tax hike at a time when we're trying to cut taxes.
Right.
But there's another measure called Proposition GG, and that potentially could be a hindrance to future tax increases, and that's one I'm somewhat concerned about. Have you taken a look at that one, Doug?
GG, not as close as the others because the others, we regard as effectively tax increases. So, and ATR opposes tax increases as a matter of principle. So those popped up more on our radar, but I think we should definitely talk about that one as well. And let me just, before we do that, just quickly introduce Paul Craney with Massachusetts Fiscal Alliance. Thanks for joining the stream, Paul. We got him live, camera working. We're technical wizards here now. So thanks for joining us, Paul.
Thanks for having me.
And let's Ben, to continue with your thought on GG.
Well, and I don't want to, I don't want to bore the audience here with all these little measures going on.
Talking about tax and budget measures. Well, we're excited by these things.
Oh yeah, great. You're in good company with me then. So here's the thing with GG, right? Is in 2020 we passed a tax cut, an income tax rate cut. And this year, this year's election, we're likely going to do that again, from the current rate down to 4.4%. We have a flat tax in Colorado, which is a great thing, but we keep passing citizens. By the way, in Colorado, we have the ability as citizens to put measures on the ballot, and that's what's happened, right? Twice now, citizens are putting these tax cuts on the ballot. Leftists in the state don't like it, and they're attempting different countermeasures to persuade voters not to give themselves tax cuts in the future. One of those is Proposition GG, and they make it seem really innocent. They say, well, what we're going to do is anytime there's a tax cut that's put on the ballot, or a tax increase, by the way, anytime there's a citizens, not the legislature can put something on the ballot. It doesn't require this to be on there. But if citizens put a tax measure on the ballot, it has to include a tax table with 8 different income levels that give you an estimate of how much certain income level would save or lose if the tax measure was passed. Now, the first problem with this, as we all know, is that when you have a flat tax, any type of breaking it up into different income categories is completely arbitrary, right? like if you were to, you can break the federal tax, income tax into different brackets because there are different income tax brackets, right?
Right.
In Colorado, we have one rate. So it's really arbitrary how this tax table would divide up the different income levels. And of course, the top two are like people making $1 million plus or people making $2 million plus, which we know is almost nobody, because even people who are very wealthy don't necessarily realize that much income in a year. They, you might have someone like Jared Polis, our Democrat governor, who's very wealthy, who, he might have actually no taxable income in a particular year. Right. So it's kind of silly to say, oh, well, anybody making over $2 million a year, if this tax cut goes into effect, they're going to save $20,000 in taxes, but the person making $70,000 is only going to save $100. Right. But what they want to do is they want to put this tax table right on the ballot rather than it being in the voter information guide. It's already in the voter information guide. They want to throw it right on the ballot. So to try to play to people's envy. Right. They want people the person making $80,000 or $70,000 to look and go, well, I'm only going to save $100, but this guy who's making $2 million a year is going to save, $10,000. Therefore, I'm going to reject my $100 tax cut. That's what they're hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to put a talking point about tax cuts helping the rich right on the ballot language to do their job for them as politically engaged people. So yeah, that would certainly not be a good one. So let's quickly summarize the bad ones here, and then we'll talk about the tax cut, and then we can talk about Massachusetts, which is unfortunately not the best news. So let's get to the good news here quickly. But you have Proposition FF, 1, 2, 3, and then GG, which changes the language, and those are sort of middling to negative. Correct, Ben?
Right. Yeah, that's right. So FF would raise taxes to fund free schools for everybody. GG, we just talked about the tax tables to try to thwart future tax cuts by citizens, which, by the way, I believe is probably a violation of the First Amendment. Right. I mean, citizens have the right in Colorado to speak through the ballot, and they can't be compelled. The citizens who put something on the ballot can't be compelled to say something they don't want to say, right? So I think that's a problem there. But and then the third one is Proposition 1, 2, 3, the affordable housing one that would reduce our table refunds. The good news on the ballot is Proposition 121. That's our tax cut. John Caldera is the citizen. Our president, John Caldera, here at Independence Institute, is the citizen sponsor of that tax measure. And it would reduce the flat income tax rate here in Colorado from 4.55 to 4.4%. We're pretty optimistic that's going to pass. But, this is, like I said before, this is part of a broader effort for us to actually eliminate Colorado's income tax. A lot of the work that we've done here at Independence Institute has brought attention to that topic during this election cycle. Polis came out last year. Governor Polis, our Democrat governor, came out and surprised everybody and said, I support zero income tax for Colorado. But then he didn't really talk about it again. That was at a conservative conference, and he kind of said it, but it's like he didn't really want to talk about it anymore. And what we at Independence Institute have been able to do is force both gubernatorial candidates to talk about this issue on the campaign trail. So it's ended up coming up in several gubernatorial debates, and we've kind of generated some conversation with the governor candidates about going to zero income tax. We're going to keep pushing for that. And, Proposition 121 is another step in that direction.
So 121 is the good one. That's the exciting one. If anybody has any questions, for Ben and Paul, please throw them into the chat and we'll get to those. 121, so it's an income tax reduction. And this is something, as you alluded to, Ben, you've been working on it and making progress over time. If I'm correct, that there was it last cycle in 2020 that there was a cut on the ballot, or was that 2018?
That was 2020. Yep, you're right.
2020. Okay, and we got that one approved.
We did.
Okay, so it's a gradual progress, but significant progress when you're getting these cycle after cycle. So very good stuff there. And let's switch over to Paul and talk a little bit more about Massachusetts. Massachusetts on the tax measure side of things has a measure to install a billionaire's tax, which we love the terminology. That's significant because we're talking about increasing tax burdens and small business owners file as individuals. And on top of that, the state has a flat tax, so this is kind of a workaround around that. So, Paul, why is this on the ballot? What's going on in Massachusetts?
Well, thanks for having me, Doug, and ATR, and Ben. Keep up the good work in Colorado. Get down to 0%. While you can, get there as quick as possible. Massachusetts has a constitutionally protected tax rate that basically says all taxpayers for their income purposes have to be taxed the same. So we have a 5% rate. I would say the left has tried to change that. This is their 7th attempt. 5 previous times the voters have rejected it. And then the most recent time in 2018, the state's highest court struck it down as unconstitutional, which fast forward brings us to next Tuesday. And it's called question 1 on the ballot. There are 4 questions for Massachusetts voters, and this is the first one. Unlike other normal ballot questions, this is proposed by lawmakers, and it's a constitutional amendment. It's not a repeal or a typical ballot question. And it would add a surcharge into our Constitution for anyone that has income over $1 million to get taxed an additional 4% on their income over $1 million. So, of course, income is not just a paycheck, but it's the sale of your home or your retirement nest egg business. And we've been arguing for actually since the 2018 campaign, we've been arguing against it. But more recently, it's been one of the biggest focuses is just to educate the public on this ballot question. And the great news is sometimes as policy people, I'm not a policy person, but there's a lot of policy people who might be watching this. Sometimes you may feel like you put out really good content and maybe no one's listening that are policy makers or influence makers or the general public. Well, I would encourage you to keep at it because I'll give you a great example. The Tax Foundation has always put out some really great studies, and we try to promote it in Massachusetts, and it usually shows where the bottom 5 states at any given category, sometimes the worst state in the country. And now all these rankings and these indexes are at the forefront because question 1 is going to impact our standing in a lot of these rankings. So about 3 weeks ago, the Tax Foundation put out a great study that showed taxpayer migration in inbound and outbound. And it showed that Massachusetts is the 4th highest state to lose taxpayer population, not per capita, but by numbers. So we're surpassing Colorado, surpassing Texas, Florida, really big states. We're only behind California, New Jersey, and Illinois. Then they put out a study.
Total number of taxpayers lost.
Yeah. It's so bad in Massachusetts that if you took all of the other New England states and combined them, we outpaced them as a combined area. But usually this stuff doesn't get picked up on, but now it's getting really picked up on because question 1 looks to make that even worse. And then last week, the Tax Foundation put out a great study. It's called the Business Tax Climate Index. Encourage you to go check it out for your state. I think it's got 5 different categories of what makes up that index. One of them is the state income tax. So Massachusetts has always had a good ranking based off of just the state income tax because it's flat, it's constitutionally protected, and it's relatively low. I mean, it's close to Colorado. Ben's, I think, 4.4%. But when you add in all the other factors, we were at, in 2014, only 8 years ago, according to Tax Foundation, we were at number 26 in the country. So middle of the road, mediocre. COVID hit all the states like Ben's state doing things to draw down their income taxes or get rid of them. I think 21 states actually reduced or eliminated their state income tax. 13 states reduced their corporate tax. Of course, Massachusetts did nothing. So we dropped down to, I think the number was 34. And then Tax Foundation put out last week in their study that if Massachusetts passes question 1, we would drop another 12 states down to 47. So that's 4th worst, only behind California, New York, and New Jersey. So there's been some really good studies out there that we've been able to use. And I do have some good news. So again, voters have always rejected this whenever it comes up to them. They kind of realize no matter what the sell is, that once these people leave the state who is left, and it's the middle class. Even if you're not impacted, even if you don't care, I would say one of the most resonating themes right now is the home sales. People realize that's a nest egg in Massachusetts because the high cost of housing. But the good news is that 2 years ago in 2020, yours truly and a bunch of other folks fought a very hard ballot question to bring ranked choice voting in Massachusetts. We were outspent. We didn't want to raise a lot of money. We raised about 10 grand, while the proponents raised about 10 million, and we beat them 55-45. But the good news in that is that there is a track record in Massachusetts for kind of nonpartisan common sense to prevail with ballot questions. And if you look at the early voting total so far in Massachusetts, they've really plummeted compared to 2020. And typically the early voting, mail-in voting, in-person voting benefits, I would say, the big government advocates. And right now, those numbers seem to be drastically lower. And we typically think people that want more freedoms and lower taxes show up on election day. So despite what some of the state polls that are done by public universities that want this tax to increase are putting out there, we kind of feel that the early voting numbers that are trickling in right now show that the other side may not be getting their vote out. And I think confirmation for that was that this week, the vice president came to Boston for a rally. So, the vice president coming to Massachusetts, an election cycle, the week of an election, that should say something. So yeah, hopefully on Tuesday we'll prevail just like we did with ranked choice voting, and keep taxes low, keep our constitutional protected income tax rate the same, and don't slip down so that we're only better than California, New York, and New Jersey.
Well, it's a great summary. So what jumps out there is that aside from how awful the exodus from Massachusetts is, which I guess there's so many other exoduses going on from bluer states, it gets a little lost in the shuffle. But there is a check here that people are realizing that even though the language of, oh, this is a millionaire's tax, which of course is meant to say we're going to tax somebody who's not you, so don't worry about it. No, they're starting to realize that there is a cost to degrading the tax base, because there's less people to share that tax burden, and the people who are increasing your taxes and spending all that money are generally not interested in stopping spending your money and reducing taxes. So, Paul, do you think that is that a trend you're noticing and you're confident in? Is there something other states can learn from that? Is there a threshold here of people leaving where other folks who are still there start to wake up?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I learned with the ranked choice fight, because the deck was stacked against us, everyone thought in Massachusetts it would pass. We had every celebrity Democrat come out and support it. The Boston Globe was trying to dunk on it many times with their editorials. But I think what it teaches you is that, especially when you take out the partisan nature of elections, when you look at issues, a lot of times common sense will prevail if you are able to fight and communicate, and you don't always need a whole lot of money to do it. I found, at least in New England, some of the traditional media, their opinions are getting devalued because people are going everywhere else to find information, which
Right.
I think kind of helps groups like us to get out there. So yeah, I would say, even though, these are tough issues to fight, even if you're in a deep blue state like Massachusetts, we prevailed 2 years ago with ranked choice voting. Hopefully we'll prevail again with this one. It should give hope that, some of these bad ideas, if they can't survive here, where can they survive? Maybe it's California, Vermont, but at least it's not California, Vermont, and Massachusetts. So hopefully it'll help your states that are a little bit more purplish, be motivated to fight them. So
Yeah. Well,
but yeah, it's funny. The New England culture up here is that we're obviously not a big state nationwide, but we're a big state in the region, and we have New Hampshire to our north, who's always trying to bring our taxpayers to their state because they don't have an income tax, they don't have a sales tax, and then you have Florida, who's always trying to siphon off our taxpayers. And I think more and more people are realizing, like, it's really easy to go domicile in those states and still enjoy Massachusetts. I think COVID really kind of made that even more apparent for everyone. So that's why I think the timing is also really good for this ballot question. If it was before the pandemic, it might be a little harder, but our state is awash in money and people are leaving, as the data showed, like crazy. And most people have some story they know of someone leaving or thinking about leaving. So I'm hoping, enough of these things coming together, despite what the proponents are promising with the benefit of this tax increase and its spending promises, that people wake up and realize, we rejected this 5 other times. The court one time struck it down. Maybe there was a good reason for that.
Yep. And again, we're talking about question 1 for Massachusetts. That's a 4% tax on any earnings over 1 million. I think, Paul, you made a really great point, which is worth reiterating. It's not just an income tax. It's anything you take in. It's much broader, which again, so this kind of thing is framed as being for millionaires, but that's not millionaires when you're talking about retirement or home value in Massachusetts. That's a lot more than people who would think of themselves as millionaire earners.
Yeah, most people think, what do I earn my paycheck? But it's so much more than that. It's your small business. And one of the other things that resonates really well is when you explained to people how small businesses sell their business as their retirement, and they don't put money in their 401ks or the IRAs. Usually the sale of their business is their income for most of their life. And most of these small business owners, especially the mom and pop shops, are not really drawing a big salary during that time. So to tax them as if there's some kind of affluent millionaire is just unfair. And that does resonate quite well up here. The other thing that resonates really well up here is the fact that the proponents are pushing this. They're saying that this will go to additional spending for transportation and education needs, because you can always point to some broken down bridge somewhere or a pothole on a road or a classroom or something, like a school needs to be painted, but there's no guarantee. Money's fungible. Only the legislature can subject appropriations. They're the only ones that can actually spend accordingly. The ballot question cannot confine them. So that seems to work really well when you talk to people. Even if you think money should go to those things, this tax isn't going to guarantee it. So there's a lot of holes that you can poke in these promises. And so the voters are just educated by election day and they make the right choice.
Very good. Well, I want to get Ben back in here before we sign off and just get any final thoughts you have, Ben, on the prospects for the various Colorado measures, and then let's just remind folks which one is the good one. And you muted yourself, which was probably smart. Well, we spent some time talking with Paul.
There we go.
Go ahead, Ben.
I don't really know how the tax increases are going to go. I'd like to say that Coloradans who are going to cut I think are going to cut their income tax rates would be smart enough not to offset that by raising other taxes on themselves. But in 2020, we saw that they cut the income tax, but then passed a massive payroll tax for paid family leave in the same year. So I really don't know how those are going to go. I'm optimistic about the income tax cut. I think we're going to win on that one. And I think the key in Colorado, despite what happens with the tax increases with FF, with 123 and GG, which isn't a tax increase, but we talked about how that can be harmful as well. I think the key in Colorado is going to be continuing to put pressure on this idea of moving towards zero income tax. It's not going to happen overnight. In fact, if we try to make it happen overnight, then it's just going to open us up to all kinds of attacks. Mm-hmm. But if we continue to apply pressure on Governor Polis, continue to hold his feet to the fire on what he said he wants to do, then I think we can continue making progress. And I really do think that Colorado has a shot at eliminating its income tax.
It's good stuff. And yeah, that's Prop 121 income tax cut. You guys also have Prop 126 for the allow liquor delivery. So, if things go bad, there's always that to fall back on.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think, Colorado has some really archaic liquor laws still in the books that they're trying to get rid of there.
Yep. So that's Prop 126 also. That's also an ATR's guide. So, we want to talk about the taxes and the wonky stuff, but I don't know if you're more interested in having a party at your house and not picking up the liquor yourself, there's 126 always down for some deregulation and innovation there. So Ben, where can folks find the work you all are doing on these issues?
Yeah, so our main website is i2i.org, or you can just type in thinkfreedom.org if it's easier to remember. It'll take you there, thinkfreedom.org. Under the issues, fiscal is where you find my work. We also have a website, path20.co, path20.co. That'll take you to our just very short one-page website about our plan to eliminate the income tax and what we're doing on that front.
That's great. Well, we love Path to Zero. And Paul, where can folks learn about Mass Fiscal and keep track of these ballot measures?
Massfiscal.org. Keep it real simple.
Very good. All right, massfiscal.org. If you want to check out Americans for Tax Reform's 2022 ballot guide, it's at atr.org/ballot guide. All right, that might be the last time I say that, although we'll do a roundup podcast to make sure we check back in on the results following the election. So really appreciate you guys coming on this afternoon. It was fun to have you. A lot of good information, and really appreciate the insight you provided. Adds a lot more background and information to what we're talking about in our ballot guide. And so really appreciate your help. And thanks for everybody for tuning in. And we'll have this on our podcast feed, Apple Podcasts, and at atr.org in a few days. So thanks for joining us. Thanks everyone. And we'll wrap it up. So we'll sign off. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.